30 AD, no modern fermentation, no stainless steel tanks, no temperature-controlled cellars, no sealed laboratories, no yeast packets purchased from a merchant's shelf. And yet, in the ancient hills of Galilee, in the sun-baked valleys of Judea, in the terraced slopes overlooking the great inland sea the locals called Kinneret, men and women turned simple grapes into something that would be poured at every table, every wedding, every sacred gathering, every quiet evening meal shared between a father and his sons. 30 AD. The beverage-making process in the time of Jesus. This is that story. The morning began the way every morning had begun for Yosef bar Shimon for the past 30 years. Before the sun had fully risen above the eastern ridge, before the light had touched the surface of the lake below, before the birds had finished their first chorus in the fig trees near the house, Yosef was already walking through his vineyard. His sandals crunched softly on the dry soil between the rows. His hands, roughened by decades of labor, brushed the leaves of the vines as he passed, feeling their texture, reading their health the way another man might read the expression on a friend's face. He was 43 years old, though anyone who saw him would have guessed much older. The sun had carved deep lines into his forehead and around his eyes. His beard, once entirely black, was now streaked with silver that caught the early light. His tunic, a simple garment of undyed wool, bore stains along the hem that would never wash out, the permanent marks of crushed grape juice from harvests past. He wore these stains without shame. They were the marks of his trade, as much a part of his identity as his name. The vineyard occupied roughly 2 acres of terraced hillside on the western slope above the lake. It was not a large property. Wealthy landowners in the lowlands to the south held estates 20 or 30 times this size, with hired laborers and overseers to manage the work. Yosef's vineyard was a family operation, tended by his own hands and those of his 2 sons. The terraces had been carved into the hillside by Yosef's grandfather, Shimon the Elder, who had cleared the rocks, built the retaining walls, and planted the first vines more than 50 years earlier. Those original vines were still producing. Their trunks had grown thick and gnarled, twisted like the arms of old men reaching toward the sky, their bark cracked and weathered. But old vines, Yosef knew with the certainty of inherited wisdom, produced the finest fruit. Their roots had pushed deep into the limestone bedrock over the decades, reaching down to sources of moisture and minerals that younger plants could never access. The grapes they bore were smaller than those from younger vines, but the juice was more concentrated, more intense in flavor, more complex in character. A single cluster from these old plants was worth, in Yosef's estimation, 3 or 4 clusters from a vine planted only 5 or 10 years ago. He paused at a vine near the center of the upper terrace and lifted a heavy cluster of grapes into his palm. The fruit was dark, almost black, with a dusty bloom on the skin that gave it a matte, powdery appearance. This bloom was something Yosef had observed all his life without fully understanding its nature. He knew only that healthy grapes had it, and that it seemed to play some role in the transformation that occurred after pressing. Grapes with a thick, intact bloom fermented more reliably than those whose bloom had been washed away by rain or rubbed off by rough handling. It was one of the many small observations that formed the foundation of his craft. Practical knowledge passed from father to son, never written down, never formally taught, but absolutely essential. He squeezed the grape gently between his thumb and forefinger. The skin gave slightly, then resisted. Good. The fruit was firm but yielding, which meant the sugars were building but had not yet reached their peak. He plucked the grape, placed it in his mouth, and bit down. The juice flooded his tongue, sweet and bright, with a sharp edge of acidity that told him the fruit needed a few more days, perhaps a week. He spat the skin and seeds onto the ground and wiped his mouth. In a week, the acidity would soften, the sweetness would deepen, and the grape would reach the precise moment of balance that Yosef was waiting for. He could not have explained this balance in scientific terms. He had no vocabulary for pH or Brix measurements. But he could taste it, could feel it, with a precision that no instrument of his era could have matched. Behind him, the crunch of sandals on the path announced his eldest son. Matityahu was 19 years old, tall and lean, with his mother's dark, intelligent eyes and the stubborn set of his father's jaw. He carried a clay water jug on his shoulder and walked with the easy, long-legged stride of youth. "The lower terrace needs attention," Yosef said without turning around. He was not a man who believed in wasting words on greetings when there was work to discuss. "The secondary shoots are pulling strength from the fruit clusters. Cut them back today." Matityahu set down the water jug on a flat stone. "I will, father, but first I need to go to Magdala. Hanan says the new storage jars are ready for collection." Yosef grunted. Storage jars were important, certainly. Without proper vessels, the entire harvest could be lost. But there was something in the way Matityahu pronounced the name Magdala that made the older man's eyes narrow. Magdala was a prosperous fishing town on the western shore of the lake, busy with merchants, travelers, and the sort of distractions that could pull a young man's mind away from the soil beneath his feet. "Take your brother," Yosef said, "and return before the sun is high. There is too much to be done here for you to spend a day wandering through market stalls." Matityahu hesitated for a moment, as though assembling words for something he wanted to say, then decided against it and turned back toward the family compound. Yosef watched him go with a faint uneasiness in his chest. He recognized that hesitation. He had felt it himself once, long ago, in the years before his own father had anchored him firmly to the land. It was the hesitation of a young man who could feel the pull of the wider world tugging at him, whispering that there was more to life than rows of vines and the endless cycle of planting and harvest. The family compound sat at the base of the hill, a modest cluster of stone buildings arranged around a central courtyard. The main house was constructed of rough-hewn limestone blocks, plastered on the interior with a mixture of lime and straw that kept the walls smooth and relatively cool. The roof was flat, made of wooden beams covered with packed mud and brush, and during the summer months it served as an additional living space where the family slept to escape the stifling heat of the enclosed rooms below. Adjacent to the main house stood a smaller structure that served as a kitchen and food preparation area, a stone-walled enclosure where the family's goats and single donkey were kept at night, and a long, low storage building where the wine jars, olive oil, dried figs, and other provisions were stored in the cool shadows. Yosef's wife, Miriam, was already at work when he returned from the vineyard. She was a small woman with quick, capable hands and an expression that could shift from sternness to warmth in the space of a heartbeat. At this moment, she was kneading bread dough on a large, flat stone, her forearms white with flour, her movements rhythmic and practiced. The courtyard smelled of the wood fire that heated the clay oven nearby and the warm, yeasty scent of dough that was nearly ready for baking. "The grapes?" she asked, not looking up from her work. "Almost. A few more days of this sun." She nodded. She understood what those words meant without needing them explained. The harvest was the hinge upon which their entire year turned. The wine they produced was not merely something to drink. It was their primary source of income, the means by which they paid the heavy taxes demanded by both the Roman administration and the temple authorities in Jerusalem. It was the commodity they traded for everything they could not produce themselves: iron tools, cloth, pottery, salt, the occasional luxury like honey or spices from the southern trade routes. A bad harvest meant a year of hardship. A good one meant security, comfort, the ability to set something aside for the future. "Matityahu has gone to Magdala again," Yosef added, settling onto a low stone bench and accepting the cup of water Miriam handed him. Again. It was not a question. The concern in her voice mirrored what Yosef himself felt. For the storage jars. The storage jars that he could have collected 3 days ago. Their eyes met, and in that brief, silent exchange, an entire conversation took place. They knew their son. They knew the restlessness that had been growing in him for months, the way his gaze drifted toward the horizon during meals, the questions he asked about trade routes and market prices that had nothing to do with the immediate concerns of the vineyard. They knew, with the helpless clarity of parents everywhere, that their eldest child was approaching a crossroads and that nothing they could say or do would prevent him from making his own choice about which path to follow. Confirm right now that you are subscribed to this channel because every story here is designed to bring you deep inside the moments of history that no one else is exploring the way we do. If you are not subscribed, tap that button now and join us, because what comes next in this story is something you truly do not want to miss. The wine press was carved into the exposed bedrock on the lower terrace of the vineyard, just below the rows of oldest vines. This was common practice throughout the hill country of Galilee and Judea. Rather than building a freestanding structure, winemakers selected a suitable outcropping of stone and carved the necessary basins directly into its surface. The result was a permanent, solid, and remarkably effective piece of equipment that would endure for generations, perhaps centuries, requiring nothing more than annual maintenance to remain functional. The Bar Shimon press consisted of 2 rectangular basins connected by a narrow channel. The upper basin, called the gat, was the larger of the two, roughly 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, and about 2 feet deep. Its floor was slightly angled, tilted toward the channel that led to the lower basin. This lower basin, smaller and deeper, was called the yekef. It served as a collection vat where the expressed juice would gather, flowing down through the channel under the simple force of gravity. Every year, several weeks before the harvest, Yosef carefully renewed the plaster that lined the interior surfaces of both basins. The plaster was a mixture of slaked lime, sand, and finely chopped straw, combined with water to form a thick paste that was applied to the stone with a flat wooden tool and smoothed by hand. This coating sealed the natural pores of the limestone, preventing precious juice from seeping into the rock, and created a surface that could be scrubbed clean before each use, reducing the risk that old residues from the previous year's pressing would contaminate the new vintage. The preparation of the press was a ritual that Yosef performed with particular care. He understood through the hard lessons passed down through his family that the cleanliness of the pressing area had a profound effect on the quality of the finished wine. Jars that had not been properly cleaned, presses that still bore traces of old grape material, tools that had been left unwashed. All of these could introduce unwanted elements that would turn a promising batch of juice into something sour, bitter, or undrinkable. The ancient world had no concept of bacteria or contamination in the modern sense, but generations of practical experience had taught winemakers that cleanliness mattered enormously, even if they could not explain precisely why. When the day of harvest finally arrived, it transformed the quiet hillside into a scene of bustling communal activity. Yosef could not manage the work alone, even with his 2 sons. Neighbors came to help, as they always did, and as Yosef in turn helped them during their own harvests. This reciprocal labor was the foundation of rural Galilean society. No family could survive entirely on its own resources. Cooperation was not merely a social nicety, but an economic necessity, and the bonds between neighboring families were strengthened and renewed through the shared work of each harvest season. The grapes were cut from the vines with small curved knives, handled with care to avoid bruising the delicate fruit, and placed into tightly woven baskets. Each basket, when full, was carried on the shoulder or balanced on the head down the terraced path to the press. Speed was essential. Grapes left exposed to the sun after cutting would begin to shrivel and lose juice, or worse, would start to break down and attract insects. The harvest was a race against time and heat, and it demanded sustained physical effort from everyone involved. By the time the upper basin was filled with grapes, a mound of dark purple fruit heaped almost to the rim, the real work began. The treading. Yosef washed his feet carefully in a basin of clean water, and his sons did the same. Then they stepped into the gat and began to crush the grapes underfoot. The treading was rhythmic, almost meditative labor. They moved in a slow, deliberate pattern, stepping and pressing, their weight carefully distributed to maximize the extraction of juice without crushing the seeds. Crushed seeds released bitter compounds into the juice that could ruin the flavor of the finished wine. The human foot, with its broad, flat surface and moderate weight, was ideally suited for this work. It applied enough pressure to burst the skins and release the liquid within, while leaving the seeds largely intact. The sensation was extraordinary. The cool, slippery mass of fruit yielded beneath each step, releasing a flood of juice that ran purple and fragrant between their toes, streamed across the angled floor of the basin, and poured through the channel into the collection vat below. The aroma was intoxicating even before any fermentation had begun. A rich, sweet, intensely fruity perfume that filled the air and carried across the hillside on the breeze. The treading was often accompanied by singing, work songs, psalms, folk melodies that had been passed down through generations. The rhythm of the songs matched the rhythm of the steps, and the music served a practical purpose beyond mere entertainment. It kept the workers in sync, maintained morale during hours of exhausting physical labor, and marked the passage of time in a way that made the work feel less endless. Neighbors in distant fields could hear the singing and know that the Bar Shimon harvest was underway. The first juice to flow from the press was called the free-run juice, and it was the most prized, lighter in color, more delicate in flavor, free of the harsher elements that would be extracted during later, more aggressive pressing. This juice would be used to produce the family's finest wine. Yosef collected it in separate jars, handling them with the reverence of a man who understood their value. After the initial treading, the remaining mass of skins, seeds, and pulp still held a significant quantity of juice. To extract it, Yosef used a pressing mechanism of ancient and simple design. A large flat stone was placed atop the pomace, and a thick wooden beam, one end anchored in a socket carved into the rock wall beside the press, was laid across the stone. Heavy rocks were suspended from the free end of the beam by ropes, creating a lever that applied steady, increasing pressure to the fruit beneath. The juice that oozed from under this weight was darker, more tannic, more robust than the free-run juice. Yosef collected it separately, destined for a different grade of wine, less refined but perfectly suitable for everyday consumption and for trade. Young Shimon, Yosef's second son, was 12 years old. He was a quiet boy, more inclined to watching than talking, with a habit of asking questions that sometimes surprised his father with their perceptiveness. He had been participating in the harvest since he was 8, and he took to the work with a natural aptitude that pleased Yosef deeply. As they worked the press that afternoon, Shimon crouched beside the collection basin and watched the juice flowing in, his face intent with concentration. "Father," he said, "why does the juice change? Why does it become wine instead of staying as it is?" Yosef paused and looked at the boy. It was a question that had been asked by every generation, and the answer given was always the same. "It is the will of the Almighty," he said. He placed within the fruit the power to transform itself. The grape carries within it everything it needs to become wine. We do not create the transformation. We only create the conditions that allow it to happen. It was the best answer available in an era when the invisible mechanisms of the natural world were entirely beyond human perception. The transformation of grape juice into wine was one of the great mysteries, as inexplicable as the growth of a seed into a tree or the formation of rain from a cloudless sky. It happened because it was meant to happen. The winemaker's role was not to understand the mystery but to serve it, to provide the proper vessels, the proper conditions, the proper care, and then to wait with patience while nature did its hidden work. The fermentation vessels used by the Bar Shimon family were large clay jars with round bellies and narrow necks, each holding roughly 40 liters. These jars were crafted by a potter named Hanan, who worked in Magdala, and they were among the most expensive single items the family purchased each year. The quality of the jar mattered enormously. A poorly made vessel, one with thin walls or microscopic cracks in the clay, could fail during fermentation, leaking juice or, worse, allowing air to penetrate and spoil the entire contents. Yosef inspected each jar with painstaking care before putting it into service, filling it with water and watching for any sign of seepage, rapping the walls with his knuckle and listening to the sound, which should be clear and resonant rather than dull or muffled. Before filling the jars with fresh juice, Yosef coated their interiors with a layer of pine resin. He melted the resin over a low fire until it became liquid, then poured a small quantity into each jar and rolled it slowly, allowing the hot resin to flow across the entire inner surface and coat it evenly. This resin lining served multiple purposes. It sealed the pores of the clay, creating a watertight barrier that prevented juice from seeping into the vessel wall. It protected the wine from absorbing the earthy mineral flavors of the raw terracotta, and it contributed its own distinctive taste to the finished wine, a resinous, slightly piney character that was typical of wines produced throughout the ancient world and that drinkers of this era expected and enjoyed. Once the fresh juice was transferred into the prepared jars, Yosef placed them in the coolest, most sheltered part of the storage building and covered each jar's mouth with a loose-fitting clay lid or a square of coarse cloth. The covering needed to be loose enough to allow the gases produced during fermentation to escape. A tightly sealed jar would build up pressure and eventually shatter, a catastrophic loss that every winemaker feared and that even the most experienced had endured at least once. And then the waiting began. In the cool dimness of the storage building, the juice began to change. At first, nothing visible happened. The liquid sat still and silent in its vessels, apparently unchanged. But within a day, sometimes less, the first signs appeared. Tiny bubbles rose to the surface, breaking with faint, barely audible pops. The surface of the liquid developed a thin film of foam. A smell began to rise from the jars, sweet and sharp and entirely different from the aroma of fresh grape juice. As the hours passed, the activity intensified. The bubbling became more vigorous, a steady effervescence that made the liquid appear almost alive, churning and roiling within its vessel. The foam on the surface thickened, turning from white to a pinkish brown. The aroma grew stronger, richer, more complex, a blend of fruit and yeast and something warm and faintly intoxicating that filled the storage building and drifted out through the doorway into the courtyard. Yosef checked the jars twice each day during this critical period, once in the morning and once in the evening. He would remove the lid, lean close and inhale deeply, reading the invisible story told by the aromas rising from the transforming liquid. A clean, fruity, slightly sharp smell meant the process was proceeding well. A sour or putrid odor was a warning of trouble, an indication that something had gone wrong, that unwanted forces had taken hold and were pushing the juice toward vinegar rather than wine. If he detected such an odor, his response was swift and decisive. The affected jar was removed immediately from the storage building and placed outside, far from the others. There was nothing that could be done to reverse the spoilage. The jar's contents would be allowed to complete their transformation into vinegar, which was itself a useful product for cooking and cleaning, but the loss of a jar of wine was a significant blow, both financially and emotionally. Each spoiled jar represented weeks of labor, careful tending, the precious fruit of vines that had been nurtured all year. It was never a trivial loss. The vigorous phase of the transformation typically lasted between 1 and 2 weeks, though the duration varied depending on factors that Yosef understood intuitively, even if he could not have explained them in analytical terms. Warmer weather accelerated the process. Cooler conditions slowed it. Juice from very ripe, sugar-rich grapes transformed more vigorously than juice from less ripe fruit. The autumn climate of Galilee, with its warm days and cool nights, generally provided favorable conditions, and Yosef had learned to time his harvest so that the transformation would occur during the most temperate weeks of the season. When the vigorous bubbling subsided, the foam diminished, and the aromas shifted from sharp and yeasty to something rounder and more settled, Yosef knew the primary transformation was complete. The juice had become wine. Young, rough, cloudy with suspended particles, but undeniably, recognizably, wine. He would taste it carefully, rolling the liquid across his tongue, assessing its strength, its balance, its character. And in that tasting, he was performing the same essential act that every winemaker in every era has performed, evaluating the product of nature's work and deciding what, if anything, needed to be done to guide it toward the best possible outcome. It was during one of his trips to Magdala that the trajectory of Mattatyahu's life began to shift. The town of Magdala, which the Greek-speaking merchants called Tarakeia, sat on the western shore of the lake and thrived on 2 industries, fishing and fish preservation. The lake teemed with tilapia and sardines, and the fishermen of Magdala hauled them from the water in enormous quantities. The fish were cleaned, layered with coarse salt in large stone vats, and left to cure in the sun. The resulting preserved fish were packed into jars and shipped to markets throughout the province and beyond. The smell of salt and curing fish pervaded the town, hanging in the air like a permanent pungent fog that newcomers found overwhelming, but that residents no longer noticed. But Magdala was more than a fishing town. It was a trading hub, a place where the agricultural products of the Galilean countryside intersected with the commercial networks that spanned the Roman provinces. Merchants passed through constantly, buying and selling goods of every description. Olive oil from the groves to the south, grain from the broad, fertile Jezreel Valley, textiles from the workshops of cities like Sepphoris and Tiberias, pottery and glassware from artisans who served both local and export markets, and wine, always wine, from the hillside vineyards that surrounded the lake like a crown of green and purple. It was in Hanan's pottery workshop that Mattatyahu met the man who would crack open the door to a wider world. His name was Alexandros, and he was a wine merchant from Caesarea Maritima, the great port city on the Mediterranean coast that had been built by Herod and now served as the administrative seat of Roman governance in the province. Alexandros was a Jew by birth but a cosmopolitan by temperament. He spoke Greek as fluently as Aramaic, conducted business with men of every nationality and background, and dressed in the Hellenistic fashion favored in the coastal cities, with a fine linen tunic bordered in color and a cloak fastened at the shoulder with a bronze pin. He was examining a collection of amphorae, the large two-handled transport jars that were the standard shipping containers for liquids throughout the Mediterranean world. Matityahu, waiting for Hanan to finish loading his storage jars onto a handcart, struck up a conversation with the merchant, and within minutes, Alexandros had steered the talk toward the subject of wine. "Your family makes wine?" Alexandros asked, his eyes sharp with professional interest. "My father has a vineyard above the lake, old vines, very good fruit." "What variety?" "The dark grape, mostly. Some white on the upper terrace." Alexandros nodded slowly, his expression becoming more focused. "I have heard good things about the wines from the western hills. My clients in Caesarea have been asking for Galilean wines specifically. There is a character to them, something mineral and earthy that the Italian and Greek imports do not have. It comes from the limestone, I think. The soil." Matityahu had never thought about his father's wine in these terms. Wine was wine, the product of their labor, a commodity to be exchanged for the things they needed. The idea that it had specific qualities that distant, sophisticated buyers might actively seek out was a revelation that shifted something fundamental in his understanding. "How much does your father produce in a good year?" 30 jars, perhaps 40. "And the price he receives?" Matityahu named a figure, and Alexandros' eyebrows rose. "That is considerably less than what such wine would bring in Caesarea. Even accounting for the cost of transport, there is a significant difference." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, and by the time it ended, a seed had been planted in Matityahu's mind that would prove impossible to uproot. Alexandros described a world of possibility that the young man had never imagined. A world where the product of his father's small hillside vineyard could travel across the province, could be valued and praised by wealthy patrons in a cosmopolitan city, could be the foundation of something larger than simple subsistence. He returned home that evening far later than his father had instructed, carrying the storage jars and a head full of ideas that he could not yet articulate. He knew with the instinct of a son who understood his father's nature that Yosef would not welcome what he had to say. The old man's world was bounded by stone walls and family traditions, by the rhythms of planting and harvest that had governed the Bar Shimon family for 3 generations. The notion of reaching beyond those boundaries into the uncertain world of long-distance commerce would strike Yosef not as opportunity, but as recklessness. So Matityahu said nothing, not that evening, and not for several days afterward. He helped his father with the daily work of the vineyard and the winemaking, but his mind was elsewhere, turning over the possibilities that Alexandros had opened up, examining them from every angle, trying to find the words in the argument that might penetrate his father's deeply ingrained caution. The days after the harvest were consumed by the ongoing work of managing the young wine as it completed its transformation. Once the vigorous fermentation subsided, the wine still required significant attention. It was cloudy, filled with suspended particles, the remnants of grape material, and the spent organisms that had driven the fermentation. These particles would settle gradually to the bottom of the jar over time, forming a thick layer of sediment called the lees. Yosef's task was to separate the clearing wine from this sediment, a process he performed by carefully decanting the liquid from one jar into another, leaving the lees behind. This had to be done gently to avoid disturbing the settled material and mixing it back into the wine. He used a clay ladle to skim the wine from the surface of the jar, transferring it cup by cup into a clean vessel. It was tedious, painstaking work that demanded a steady hand and considerable patience, but the result was worth the effort. Each racking, as this process was called, produced a noticeably clearer wine, and after 3 or 4 repetitions over the course of several weeks, the liquid would be bright and luminous, free of the cloudiness that had characterized the young, freshly fermented juice. The lees left behind after each racking were not wasted. Yosef mixed them with water to produce a thin, weakly alcoholic beverage that the family drank as their everyday refreshment. This secondary drink was far less potent than the proper wine, and was considered a staple rather than a luxury, something to be consumed with meals and throughout the working day. Water alone in this era and place was often unreliable. Wells and springs could harbor invisible dangers that caused illness, and the slightly fermented, mildly acidic nature of wine and wine-based beverages provided a measure of protection against these unseen threats. This was understood not in terms of science, but in terms of practical experience. People who drank wine and diluted wine stayed healthier on average than people who drank only water from untested sources. The reason was unknown, but the observation was reliable enough to have become embedded in daily practice. In addition to grape wine, the household produced several other fermented beverages that were common throughout the region. Miriam prepared a drink from dates, which were abundant in the lower Jordan Valley and available dried in every market. The dried dates were soaked in water until they softened and released their sugars, and the resulting sweet liquid was left to ferment in covered jars for several days. The finished product was sweeter than grape wine, with a rich dark color and a flavor reminiscent of honey and caramel. It was particularly popular during the winter months, when its warmth and sweetness were comforting. She also made a fermented beverage from pomegranates, another fruit that thrived in the Galilean climate. The seeds were crushed to release their juice, which was strained, sweetened slightly with honey if the fruit was particularly tart, and allowed to ferment. The result was a sharp, refreshing drink with a brilliant ruby color that made it visually striking when poured into the simple clay cups the family used for everyday meals. These various beverages, grape wine in several grades, date wine, pomegranate wine, and the diluted secondary drinks made from lees, formed the backbone of the family's liquid diet. They were consumed at every meal, typically diluted with water in the ratio of 2 or 3 parts water to 1 part wine. Drinking wine undiluted was considered excessive, even barbaric by some, and the practice of dilution was nearly universal among the peoples of the ancient world. The tension between Yosef and Matityahu reached its breaking point on a cool evening shortly after the festival of Sukkot. The family had gathered on the flat rooftop of their house to share the evening meal, as was their custom during mild weather. The sky was immense and dark, blazing with stars undimmed by any artificial light, and the air carried the faint, clean scent of the lake below. Yosef was in good spirits. The year's wine was developing beautifully. The jars in the storage building held liquid that even his critical palate had to acknowledge was among the best he had ever produced. The color was deep and rich. The aroma was complex and inviting. The flavor was balanced, the fruit character pure and intense, supported by firm but not harsh tannins and a pleasant mineral undertone that he associated with the best sections of his vineyard. It was into this atmosphere of rare contentment that Matityahu dropped his proposal, the way a stone drops into still water. "Father, I need to talk to you about the wine, about what we do with it." Yosef's good mood cooled visibly. "What about it?" "There is a merchant in Magdala, a wine trader named Alexandros. He deals in Caesarea on the coast. He told me that Galilean wines are highly valued there, that wealthy buyers specifically seek them out. He said the prices in Caesarea are more than double what we receive in the local markets. And if we could establish a trading arrangement with him, even a small one, we could increase our income significantly. We could use the additional resources to improve the vineyard, perhaps acquire the fallow plot on the eastern slope that old Ezra has been wanting to sell. We could invest in better storage, better jars, a second press for handling larger harvests." Yosef set down his cup of diluted wine with the careful deliberation of a man who was controlling his temper. "You want to send our wine to Caesarea?" "Yes, father. To be sold to strangers in a Roman city by a merchant who dresses like a Greek. He is a Jew, from a respected family. He has been in the wine trade for years. A Jew who has forgotten what it means to be rooted in the land. I know men like this, Matityahu. They move between cities, between cultures, between loyalties. They belong nowhere because they have chosen to belong everywhere. And they will use your wine, your father's wine, the product of this family's labor and this family's land, as nothing more than a commodity to be traded for their own profit. That is the nature of trade, father. He profits and so do we. And what happens when the trade fails? When this merchant finds cheaper wine from somewhere else? When a shipment is lost on the road to bandits? When the Romans decide to raise the customs fees at the port? We would have expanded beyond our means, taken on burdens we cannot carry, and when the arrangement collapses, as arrangements with merchants always do, we would be left worse off than when we started." Matityahu pressed on, though he could feel the ground hardening beneath him. "Alexandros has dealt with all of these risks. He knows the roads and the customs officials. He has guards for his caravans. He has clients who are loyal to him because he delivers consistent quality. Consistent quality from vineyards he does not own, using wine he did not make, from families he will abandon the moment a better opportunity presents itself. This is what merchants do, my son. They attach themselves to producers when times are good and detach themselves when times are bad. The risk stays with us. The profit goes to them." The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Miriam had stopped eating. Shimon stared at his plate. The stars above seemed to burn more coldly. "Father," Matityahu said quietly, "I am not asking you to change who you are or what this family does. I am asking you to let the world know what you have already accomplished. The wine you make is remarkable. Alexandros said so. Other merchants would say the same. It deserves to be recognized beyond these hills. It deserves to be tasted by people who will appreciate it for what it is." Yosef looked at his son for a long moment. "And what is it?" "It is the best wine in the Galilee, made by the best vine dresser I know." Whether it was the flattery, the sincerity, or simply the persistence that finally created a crack in Yosef's resistance, something shifted in the old man's expression. Not agreement. Not yet. But the absolute refusal that had been written on his face moments earlier softened into something more complicated. "I will think about it," he said. "Do not mistake this for yes. I will think." But Matityahu heard what lay beneath those words. His father had not said no. And for a man as rigid as Yosef Bar Shimon, the absence of no was as close to yes as you were likely to get without considerable patience and time. Before you continue listening, I want you to do something right now. If this story is making you think about how much knowledge and skill went into the simplest things our ancestors made, write in the comments this exact phrase. "We have forgotten what our ancestors knew." That sentence lets us know this story is reaching hearts, and it matters more than you realize. What Matityahu did next was impulsive, reckless by his father's standards, and entirely characteristic of a young man who believed that action was superior to waiting. 3 days after the rooftop conversation, he left the family compound before dawn, carrying a leather pack with provisions and 2 small sealed jars of his father's best wine, wrapped carefully in cloth. He told his mother he was going to Caesarea. He did not tell his father. Miriam stood at the gate and watched her son disappear down the path toward the lake road, her face a landscape of conflicting emotions. She was afraid for him, afraid of the dangers of a long road traveled alone, afraid of what Yosef would say when he discovered the boy was gone. But she was also in a place she kept carefully hidden from her husband, proud. She had once confided to Matityahu that Yosef himself, as a young man, had nearly left the vineyard to join a merchant caravan heading to Damascus. He had stayed because his own father fell ill and needed him. But I have always wondered, Miriam had told her son, what your father would have become if he had gone. The journey to Caesarea took 3 days on foot. The road led south along the lake shore, through Magdala with its fish markets and salt-cured air, past the warm springs at Hamat where the earth breathed steam and minerals, and then west, climbing out of the deep rift of the Jordan Valley through a series of mountain passes before descending into the broad coastal plain. Matityahu walked through landscapes that shifted beneath his feet like the turning pages of a great scroll. The green terraced hills of Galilee gave way to the golden grasslands of the foothills, which in turn yielded to the flat, dark-soiled farmland of the coast, where estates larger than anything in the hill country stretched to the horizon in neat, ordered rows. He traveled with other people when possible, joining groups of merchants and pilgrims on the road for safety. Bandits were a real and constant threat, particularly in the more remote stretches between towns. He camped at night near other fires, sleeping with his precious jars of wine tucked close against his body. On the second evening, he shared a campfire with an elderly man traveling to Joppa. They spoke for hours, and the old man, upon learning of Matityahu's mission, offered a piece of advice that the young man would carry with him for the rest of his life. "The quality of your wine is the beginning of the conversation," the old man said, poking the fire with a stick. "It is not the conversation itself. A merchant must trust the man who supplies him, not just the product. You must show this Alexandros not only that your wine is good, but that you are reliable, that you understand what you are promising, and that you can deliver it. The wine opens the door. Your character is what walks through it." When Matityahu first saw the Mediterranean, he stopped walking and stood motionless for what felt like an eternity. Nothing in his landlocked Galilean experience had prepared him for the sight of that water. The Lake of Kinneret was beautiful, yes, but it was contained, bounded, comprehensible. The sea was something else entirely. It stretched to the very edge of the world, an unbroken expanse of blue-green that merged with the sky at a line so distant it seemed imaginary. The sheer scale of it compressed everything Matityahu had ever known into something small and local, and in that compression, paradoxically, he found not diminishment, but expansion. If the world was this vast, then the possibilities within it were equally vast. And there, on the shore below him, Caesarea gleamed. White stone, colonnaded streets, a harbor ringed by massive stone breakwaters that sheltered dozens of ships with tall masts swaying gently. An aqueduct marched toward the city from the north, its arches striding across the landscape like the legs of a stone giant. The curved form of a great amphitheater hugged the southern edge of the city, and above the harbor, the massive bulk of a temple dedicated to the Roman emperor dominated the skyline. Matityahu entered the city through the eastern gate and was immediately engulfed in a world of noise, color, and movement that was as different from his quiet hillside village as fire is from water. The streets were paved with stone, a luxury he had never experienced. Buildings rose 2 and 3 stories high, their facades decorated with painted plaster and carved stone. Merchants shouted their wares from open-fronted shops. Roman soldiers in gleaming armor patrolled in pairs. The air smelled of the sea, of cooking food, of incense, of the 1,000 mingled scents of a thriving cosmopolitan city. Finding Alexandros was easier than expected. The merchant was known in the commercial quarter near the harbor, and a brief inquiry directed Matityahu to a large warehouse building where Alexandros conducted his business. The merchant received the young Galilean with surprise but genuine warmth, seating him in a comfortable room and offering water and fresh bread. "You walked from the Galilee," Alexandros said, more statement than question. 3 days. Alone? With other travelers on the road, but yes, alone. Alexandros studied the young man with eyes that had evaluated hundreds of business propositions from hundreds of eager suppliers. What he saw was not merely a dusty farm boy with 2 small jars of wine. He saw determination, initiative, and a willingness to take personal risk in pursuit of a goal. These were qualities that Alexandros valued, because they were the qualities that made a trading partner reliable. "Let us taste your father's wine," he said. Matityahu uncorked the first jar and poured a measure into one of the small clay tasting cups that sat on a low table. Alexandros raised the cup to his nose first, inhaling with the focused concentration of a professional. Then he sipped, held the wine on his palate, and swallowed. He was silent for a moment. "This is the first pressing?" "Yes. Old vines. More than 20 years. "The dark grape?" "Yes." Alexandros took another sip, and Matityahu saw a change come over the merchant's face. The professional courtesy remained, but something sharper had appeared beneath it, the glint of genuine commercial interest. "This is very fine," he said quietly. "There is a purity to the fruit that I have not often encountered, and underneath a mineral quality almost like wet stone that gives it structure and depth. How much of this grade can your father produce?" "Perhaps 20 jars in a good year." "That is not a great quantity, but quality on this level creates its own market. Scarcity, when paired with excellence, is not a disadvantage." He set down his cup. "What does your father think of you being here?" Matityahu answered with the only currency he had. "My father does not know I have come. He is cautious. and he fears the risks of dealing with the wider world. But the wine speaks for itself, and I believe that when he sees a fair proposal with real terms, his caution will yield to reason. Alexandros regarded him steadily. I respect your honesty, and I will match it with my own. This wine is excellent, and I want it for my clients. But I will not build a trading relationship on a foundation that your own father has not approved. Here is what I propose. Go home. Present these terms to your father.
These are quite beautiful.
He named a price per jar that was considerably more than double what the Bar Shimon family received in the local markets. If he agrees, we begin next year with a small consignment, 5 jars of first pressing wine. I will arrange the transport and bear the cost. If the wine sells well, we increase the quantity the following year. This is a cautious arrangement. It should appeal to a cautious man. Matityahu's heart hammered in his chest. He thanked Alexandros, accepted a parchment on which the merchant had written the specific terms of the proposal, and prepared to leave. But Alexandros stopped him. Stay tonight. I have quarters for guests. In the morning, I want to show you something that may help you make your case. What Alexandros showed him the following morning was the harbor itself, and more specifically, the wine trade that flowed through it like a river of wealth and culture. They walked along the stone quays where ships from across the known world were docked, their hulls heavy with cargo. Alexandros pointed and explained. That vessel, from the Italian coast, carried wines from the famous estates there, rich and potent, aged in vessels sealed with pitch. That smaller ship, from one of the Greek islands, held a sweet, aromatic wine flavored with honey and herbs that was prized at banquets. Another, from the African coast, carried a cheap, strong wine destined for the taverns and military camps where common laborers and soldiers drank. Wine flows through this port like blood through the body, Alexandros said. It connects the provinces of the world. A wine made in your father's vineyard above the lake could, through this harbor, reach tables in cities you have never heard of. But more importantly, what travels with the wine is identity. When a wealthy man in Caesarea pours your father's wine for his guests, he is not merely offering them a drink. He is offering them a story. The story of those hills, those old vines, that ancient soil. The wine carries the place within it, and the place is what makes it valuable. It was a concept that struck Matityahu with the force of revelation, because it described, in the language of commerce, the very thing his father loved most about his work. Yosef did not merely make wine. He expressed the land through the wine. The minerals of the limestone, the heat of the Galilean sun, the cool breath of the lake breezes at night. All of these were present in the glass, and what Alexandros was proposing was not the corruption of that expression, but its amplification. The journey home took 3 days, as it had going, but the road felt shorter. Matityahu's mind was racing, composing and revising the argument he would present to his father, anticipating every objection and preparing every counter. He arrived home after dark on the 4th day, to find, as he expected, a household in turmoil. His mother met him at the gate with tears and anger fighting for dominance in her expression. His brother looked relieved but also alarmed, and his father was nowhere in sight. He is in the vineyard, Miriam whispered. He has been there since he discovered you had gone. He has hardly spoken. The guilt hit Matityahu like a physical blow. He had anticipated his father's anger, but he had not fully reckoned with the fear, the helpless worry of a father whose son had vanished without explanation onto a dangerous road. In his eagerness to prove himself, he had caused pain to the person he most wanted to impress. He found Yosef sitting on the low stone wall at the edge of the upper terrace, facing the lake. The water below was dark and still, a mirror reflecting the countless stars. Yosef did not turn when he heard his son approaching. Father. Silence. I went to Caesarea. I found the merchant. I showed him your wine. My wine. That you took without permission. Yes. And? Matityahu told him everything. The tasting, Alexandros' reaction, the proposed terms, the harbor, the ships, the wider world of wine trade that existed beyond their small corner of the Galilee. He spoke with controlled passion, laying out the facts as clearly as he could, resisting the urge to embellish or exaggerate. When he finished, Yosef was quiet for a long time. The silence was not the stony, impenetrable silence of refusal. It was the silence of a man who was thinking, weighing, measuring the new information against the framework of caution and experience that had governed his life. Finally, he turned and looked at his son. In the moonlight, Matityahu could see his father's face, and what he saw there surprised him. There was anger, yes, and the residue of fear. But beneath these, something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. When I was your age, Yosef said quietly, a caravan master offered me a place on his route to Damascus. Good wages, adventure, everything a young man could want. My father refused to let me go. He said I was needed here. He said a man who leaves his land leaves part of himself behind. Yosef paused. I hated him for it. For years. I believed he had denied me my future. It was only much later after he was gone and I had sons of my own that I understood what he was protecting. Not just the vineyard, not just the tradition, but a way of being in the world that is rooted in something real, something you can touch and taste and hold in your hands. He paused again. But I also know that the world does not stand still because we wish it to, The Romans are here, the roads are here, the merchants are here. If I refuse to see that, I am not protecting this family. I am simply covering my own eyes and hoping the world will leave us alone. Let me see the terms. Matityahu produced the parchment with hands that trembled slightly. Yosef took it, angled it toward the moonlight, and read it slowly, twice, his lips moving soundlessly over the Aramaic script. 5 jars, he murmured. First pressing only. Yes. At this price. Yes. Yosef folded the parchment and placed it inside his robe. I will think about it. But Matityahu heard in those words something that his father perhaps did not intend to reveal. There was a door opening, slowly, cautiously, but opening nonetheless. In the language of Yosef Bar Shimon, I will think about it, was as close to agreement as an earthquake is to the tremor that precedes it. The winter that followed was a season of quiet transformation, not unlike the slow, invisible transformation that occurred within the wine jars in the storage building. On the surface, nothing appeared to have changed. Yosef went about his winter work with his usual methodical discipline, pruning the dormant vines, repairing the terrace walls, maintaining the press, cleaning and preparing the storage building for the next harvest. He did not mention Alexandros or the proposal, and Matityahu, exercising a patience he had not previously known he possessed, did not raise the subject. But changes were visible to those who knew where to look. Yosef spent more time in the vineyard than usual, even for the winter season. He examined the soil with unusual intensity, crumbling it between his fingers, studying its color and texture. He evaluated each vine individually, assessing its health, its vigor, the thickness and placement of its shoots. He visited a neighboring vineyard, something he had never done before, traveling several miles to spend a day with a man named Yohanan, who was widely regarded as one of the finest winemakers in the region. The two men tasted wine, compared techniques, and discussed the craft with the mutual respect of equals, who understood that they could learn from each other. When Yosef returned from that visit, there was a light in his eyes that Matityahu had never seen. Not the bright, impulsive energy of youth. Something deeper. The renewed engagement of a master craftsman who had been reminded that his craft contained depths he had not yet fully explored. Spring came, and with it the first tender green shoots pushing from the old gnarled trunks. Summer followed, relentless and golden, ripening the fruit on the vine. And when the harvest arrived, Yosef approached it with an intensity and focus that elevated his work from skill to artistry. Every cluster was evaluated individually. Any fruit that showed the slightest imperfection, a spot of rot, insect damage, uneven ripening, bird marks, was rejected and set aside for the lower grades. Only the most perfect fruit, the deepest in color, the most concentrated in aroma, the most precisely ripe, was selected for the first pressing. The treading was performed with exceptional care. Yosef limited the pressing time to ensure only the purest free-run juice was collected. He selected his finest storage jars, the ones with the smoothest interiors and the most even resin coatings. He monitored the fermentation with obsessive attention, checking the jars 3 times daily instead of 2, tasting tiny samples at each stage, making minute adjustments in how tightly the lid sat, how much air could circulate in the storage room, how the jars were positioned relative to the cooler and warmer parts of the building. The wine that emerged from this painstaking process was, by Yosef's own quiet admission, the finest he had ever made. Deep in color, rich and complex in aroma, with a purity of fruit character that was remarkable, and a long, warming finish that lingered on the palate and left a sense of completeness, of wholeness, that was difficult to describe, but unmistakable to experience. He selected 5 jars and sealed them with fresh resin-coated stoppers, marking each with the Bar Shimon family mark. And then, with a gravity that silenced the household, he announced his decision. The wine goes to Caesarea. Matityahu will take it, and I will go with him. The surprise was absolute. Miriam dropped the bread she was holding. Shimon's mouth fell open. Matityahu, who had spent months carefully not hoping for this outcome, felt his eyes burn with emotion he did not trust himself to express. Yosef, who had not traveled more than a day's walk from his vineyard in longer than he could remember, was going to the coast. Young Shimon, who had been quietly hoping for an adventure of his own, was given the formidable responsibility of managing the vineyard and the remaining wine in his father's absence. He accepted the charge with a solemnity that made Yosef's heart swell with quiet pride. The boy was 12 years old, but in his steady gaze and capable hands, Yosef could see the winemaker he would one day become. The journey changed Yosef in ways he did not fully comprehend at the time. The road itself was an education. He saw the Roman roads with their milestones and their engineering, the bridges spanning rivers, the way stations where travelers could find food and shelter. He saw the vast agricultural estates of the coastal plain, with their organized rows of crops and their gangs of hired laborers. He saw how goods moved from place to place, how the infrastructure of empire facilitated the exchange of products and ideas across distances that would have seemed impossible to his grandfather. When he first caught sight of the sea, he stopped walking and stood in silence for a long time, just as his son had done weeks earlier. The Mediterranean stretched before him, impossibly vast, impossibly blue, a world of water that made the lake of his home seem like a basin in a courtyard. And on the shore, Caesarea spread its white stone buildings and colonnaded streets and massive harbor works in a display of human ambition and achievement that both awed and unsettled him. Alexandros received them warmly. He was visibly pleased that the father had come in person, understanding that this represented a decision of considerable significance. He arranged a formal tasting, inviting 3 of his most discerning clients: a Roman official with a reputation as a knowledgeable connoisseur, a Greek shipowner who had traveled widely and tasted wines from across the world, and a Jewish merchant who specialized in luxury goods. The tasting took place in a shaded courtyard within Alexandros' warehouse compound. The 5 jars were opened, and the wine was poured into small cups. The 3 clients tasted slowly, with the focused attention of experienced evaluators, and the conversation that followed was a revelation for Yosef. These men did not merely drink his wine. They discussed it with a vocabulary and a precision that he had always felt intuitively but had never heard articulated. They spoke of the mineral quality imparted by the limestone soil, of the balance between fruit sweetness and structural firmness, of the length of the finish and the complexity of the aromatic profile. They compared it favorably to wines from other regions, praising its distinctiveness and its integrity. "This wine has character," the Roman official said, holding his cup up to the light to admire the deep, clear color. "There is an honesty to it that you cannot fabricate. It tastes like the place it comes from." Yosef listened to these words and felt something shift within him. Not pride exactly, though there was that. Something more like vindication. A confirmation that the life he had chosen, the endless labor and the meticulous care and the stubborn refusal to cut corners, had produced something of genuine value, recognized not just within the small circle of his village, but by worldly men in a major city. That evening, Yosef and Alexandros sat down together and formalized their arrangement. The terms were fair, as the merchant had promised. The price was generous, the logistics were clear. Alexandros would send a transport team to the Galilee the following autumn to collect the wine, bearing all costs and risks of the journey. The initial consignment would be 10 jars, double the original proposal, because, as Alexandros put it, "I have 3 clients who will want this wine, and 5 jars will not satisfy even one of them." On the road home, father and son walked side by side in a companionable quiet that was new to their relationship. The friction of the preceding months had not vanished, but it had transformed into something more productive, a mutual acknowledgement that they saw the world differently, but that both perspectives had value. On the second evening, camped beside the road with a small fire crackling between them, Yosef spoke words that cost him visible effort. "I owe you an apology, not for being cautious. Caution has kept this family alive for 3 generations, but for allowing fear to wear the mask of wisdom. They are not the same thing. You were protecting us," Matityahu said. "I was protecting myself, from change, from uncertainty, from the possibility that my son might understand the world better than I do." He stared into the fire. "The vineyard is not going anywhere. The vines will grow, the grapes will ripen, the wine will be made, whether I sell it here or in Caesarea or at the ends of the earth. What matters is that we make it with integrity, that we do not chase profit at the expense of quality, that we never forget why we do this." "And why do we do this, father?" Yosef was quiet for a moment. "Because the grape does not choose to become wine. It simply becomes what it was created to become, given the right conditions. Our task is to create those conditions, to tend the vine with devotion, to harvest at the precise moment, to crush the fruit with care, to wait with patience while the transformation occurs. We do not command the process, we serve it, and in serving it, we participate in something that is older than our family, older than our people, older than memory itself." They arrived home the following afternoon to find Shimon waiting at the gate, nearly bursting with news. During their absence, the boy had done something remarkable. He had taken it upon himself to taste each of the remaining jars of wine individually, and then, following an instinct he could not explain, he had blended small samples from 3 different jars together. The result, he claimed, was better than any of the individual components. Yosef tasted the blend and was silent for a long, charged moment. The wine on his tongue was extraordinary. The 3 components, one rich in fruit but too sharp, another soft and round but lacking definition, the third lean and mineral but somewhat austere, had merged into something that transcended all of them. The blend was balanced, harmonious, complex, greater than the sum of its parts. "You did this yourself?" Yosef asked. "Yes, father." "How did you know which jars to combine?" The boy shrugged with the unconscious ease of natural talent. "I tasted them and I could hear how they would sound together, like voices in a song. One alone is thin, but together they become something whole." Yosef looked at Matityahu, and for the first time in the long, fraught conversation about the future of their family, the old man laughed. It was a genuine, warm, unguarded sound that seemed to release something that had been held too tightly for too long. "It seems," he said, shaking his head in wonder, "that I have not one son with gifts I did not expect, but 2. The years that followed brought a season of growth and discovery that none of them could have predicted. The partnership with Alexandros flourished. The bar Shemin Wine developed a loyal following among the wealthy patrons of Caesarea, and demand grew steadily year by year. The 10-jar consignment became 15, then 20. Alexandros reported that clients were asking for the wine by name, requesting "the wine from the old vines above the lake," a description that served as both designation and advertisement. Yosef, far from being diminished by the commercial success, was energized by it. The recognition of his craft by knowledgeable outsiders had awakened a creative impulse that had been lying dormant beneath his conservative exterior. He began to experiment, cautiously at first and then with increasing confidence. He tried harvesting sections of his vineyard at slightly different stages of ripeness, discovering that grapes picked a few days earlier produced a wine with brighter acidity and more vivid fruit character, while grapes left slightly longer on the vine yielded a richer, more concentrated product. By blending these different harvests together, he could create wines of remarkable complexity. He experimented with the maceration period, the time the fresh juice remained in contact with the grape skins after pressing. Longer maceration extracted more color and more of the structural compounds that gave the wine body an aging potential. Shorter maceration produced a lighter, more immediately approachable wine. He tried different ratios and settled on a practice that gave him the best of both approaches. A moderate maceration for the bulk of the wine, with a small portion given extended skin contact and then blended back in to add depth and backbone. He also experimented with the resin coatings inside his storage jars. By varying the type of resin and the thickness of the application, he could subtly adjust the flavor profile of the finished wine. A lighter coating allowed more of the pure grape character to come through. A heavier coating imparted more of the resinous piney notes that some drinkers favored. He began coating different jars with different resin types, giving himself a wider palette of flavors to work with when it came time for the final blending. Matityahu, meanwhile, grew into a capable and respected figure in the regional wine trade. He made regular trips to Caesarea, and his network of contacts expanded to include merchants, innkeepers, and wealthy private buyers in cities across the province. He learned to speak Greek passably well, to navigate the complexities of Roman tax and customs procedures, and to conduct himself with the quiet confidence that the old traveler by the roadside had told him was essential for success in commerce. But he never lost his connection to the land. Every year, without exception, he returned for the harvest. He stood in the pressing basin with his father and his brother, feeling the cool grapes yield beneath his feet, hearing the ancient songs that accompanied the work, breathing the intoxicating perfume of crushed fruit that filled the air. These moments anchored him. They reminded him that the wine he sold in distant cities was not merely a product. It was the expression of a place, a family, a tradition that stretched back further than any of them could trace. Young Shyman developed into the most naturally talented winemaker of the three. His palate was extraordinary, capable of detecting nuances of flavor and aroma that even his father could barely perceive. His instinct for blending, first demonstrated in that childhood experiment with the 3 jars, grew more refined with each passing year. By the time he was 18, he had assumed primary responsibility for the fermentation and aging of the wine, and Yosef, watching his youngest son work, recognized in him a gift that transcended mere skill. Shimon did not simply make wine, he communed with it, seemed to understand it in a way that bypassed conscious thought, and operated at the level of pure intuition. The family had found, almost organically, a division of labor that played to each member's strengths. Yosef tended the vineyard, nurturing the vines with the devotion of a lifetime. Shimon guided the transformation from grape juice to finished wine, bringing an almost mystical sensitivity to the process. And Matityahu managed the commercial side, connecting their craft to the wider world that would value and sustain it. They were 3 aspects of a single enterprise, each essential, each incomplete without the others. The world around them was vast and turbulent, shaped by forces that dwarfed their small hillside vineyard. Great events were unfolding in the towns and cities of the province, events that would reshape the course of history in ways no one alive could foresee. Teachers and prophets walked the same roads Matityahu traveled, drawing crowds and stirring controversy. Political tensions between the Jewish population and the Roman authorities simmered constantly, occasionally boiling over into open confrontation. The temple in Jerusalem was a crucible of religious passion and political maneuvering, where rival factions competed for influence and power in an atmosphere of increasing intensity. Against this sweeping backdrop, the Bar Shimon family continued their ancient work. They pruned and planted, harvested and pressed, fermented and blended, sold and traded. Their concerns were the timeless concerns of people who live close to the earth: the weather, the health of the crop, the quality of the soil, the fairness of the market, the strength of the family, the hope that what they had built would endure beyond their own brief lives. And the beverages they produced, those carefully crafted wines and fermented drinks, continued to play their quiet, essential role in the daily life of the community. They were served at every meal, shared at celebrations and festivals, offered to guests as the most fundamental expression of hospitality and friendship. They were poured at weddings, consumed during religious observances, traded for goods and services, given as gifts, stored as a form of wealth. They were woven into the fabric of daily existence so thoroughly that a meal without wine was almost unthinkable, a celebration without it incomplete, a gesture of welcome without it hollow. The method by which these beverages were made, the ancient process of harvesting, crushing, fermenting, and aging that Yosef Bar Shimon practiced with such devotion, was a tradition of staggering antiquity. It had been developed over thousands of years, not through formal research or deliberate invention, but through the slow, patient accumulation of observation and experience. Each generation of winemakers had contributed something: a small refinement, a practical insight, a technique discovered by accident and preserved through repetition. The collective wisdom of all these generations was encoded not in written texts, but in the hands and noses and tongues of the living practitioners, passed from parent to child in an unbroken chain that stretched back to the very beginnings of settled agriculture. Yosef Bar Shimon was one link in that chain. He had received the knowledge from his father and would pass it on to his sons, who would refine it further and pass it on to theirs. The tools were simple: a stone press, clay jars, pine resin, clean water, bare feet, and patient hands. The understanding was incomplete. The invisible mechanism that turned sweet juice into wine remained as mysterious to Yosef as the rising of the sun or the falling of rain. But the practical mastery was profound. He could read his vines the way a scholar reads a text. He could taste his wine and know, with absolute certainty, whether it was proceeding well or heading toward trouble. He could blend disparate components into a harmonious whole that was greater than any individual part. He could not explain why any of this worked. He only knew that it did, because it always had. As the sun sank toward the western hills on a quiet evening in that pivotal year, Yosef Bar Shimon sat on the wall of his vineyard and looked out over the landscape that had defined every chapter of his life. The Sea of Galilee lay below, calm and luminous, its surface catching the last gold of the fading light and reflecting it back in a shimmer that seemed to pulse like something alive. The terraced hillside around him was thick with the scent of ripening grapes, that heavy, sweet, intoxicating fragrance that he had breathed every autumn for as long as he could remember. The stone beneath him was warm from the day's sun, and the air was beginning to cool with the first hint of evening. In the storage building behind him, the new vintage rested in its jars, quietly undergoing the slow, hidden transformation that was the foundation of everything he did, everything he was. In the house below, Miriam was preparing the evening meal, and the sounds of her work drifted up the hillside. The rhythmic slap of bread dough, the soft clatter of pottery, the murmur of a song she hummed to herself as she worked. His sons were somewhere nearby. Matityahu likely composing a letter to Alexandros about the autumn shipment. Shimon probably in the storage room, leaning over a jar with his nose hovering just above the surface, reading the wine the way his father read the vines. Yosef closed his eyes and breathed deeply. The scent of the vineyard filled his lungs, and he felt, with a certainty that went beyond thought, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not because the world beyond these hills was without value or interest. He had seen Caesarea. He had tasted its possibilities. He understood now that the wider world was not the enemy of the life he had built. It was the audience. And the wine he made was the message, the thing he sent out into that world to say, "This is who we are. This is what our land produces. This is the fruit of our labor and our love." The ancient art of making beverages in this place, in this era, was not a primitive precursor to something better. It was a complete and self-sufficient tradition, a body of knowledge and practice that was exquisitely adapted to the materials, conditions, and understanding available. The men and women who practiced it were not ignorant laborers awaiting enlightenment. They were skilled artisans operating within a different framework of knowledge, achieving results that were, within that framework, remarkable. The wines of the Galilee, made in stone presses and clay jars by families like the Bar Shimons, were genuine products of craft and care, beverages that could satisfy discerning palates and that carried within them the unmistakable character of the land, the climate, and the people who made them. In the deepening twilight, Yosef opened his eyes and looked once more at the vineyard, at the old twisted vines his grandfather had planted, at the stone walls his family had built, at the press carved into the living rock below. Everything here spoke of continuity, of the patient, devoted repetition of ancient acts through the turning of the seasons and the passing of the years. The grape would ripen, the fruit would be crushed, the juice would transform, the wine would be poured. And in that pouring, in the sharing of something that had been made with care and intention and love, the deepest human needs would be served. The need for sustenance, for community, for celebration, for the sacred, for the simple, profound pleasure of sitting with the people you love at the end of a long day and raising a cup to the enduring mystery of a world that offers, again and again, the gift of transformation. 30 AD. No modern fermentation, no laboratories, no instruments, no scientific theories. Only the sun, the soil, the vine, the stone, the hands, and the faith that what had always been given would continue to be given, season after season, generation after generation, for as long as men and women were willing to serve the ancient, patient, magnificent process that turned the fruit of the earth into something more than itself. That was how beverages were made in the time of Jesus. And it was, in every way that matters, enough. If you watch this all the way to the end, it is because this story touched something real inside you. Leave a comment right now saying, "I watched until the end," so that I can get to know you and see who truly values the stories we tell on this channel. If this journey through the ancient world moved you, hit the like button right now, because every single like tells us to keep creating stories like this, stories that take you places no one else is going. And share this with someone who loves history, someone who would appreciate knowing how life really worked 2,000 years ago, because stories like this are too valuable to keep to yourself. And if you are not yet subscribed, do it now. Subscribe to this channel because every week we go deeper into the forgotten corners of history, into the moments and the people that shape the world we live in today. You do not want to miss what is coming next. Subscribe now and we will see you in the next story.